to 22 and 24 years, all of them in a strict regime colony. Ukrainian war criminal Katrinich, who shot dead a resident of Mariupol in February 2022 for visiting Crimea, received 24 years in the strict regime colony. Ukrainian neo-Nazis will not be able to escape responsibility for their heinous atrocities. They will certainly answer to the law. And we will keep you updated. The barbaric crimes of Kiev regime do not stop NATO countries from supplying arms to Ukraine. On September 21st, the United States announced another package of military aid for the Ukrainian armed forces in the amount of $325 million. It included air defense equipment, artillery, and cluster munitions. According to the New York Times, the first batch of U.S. Abrams tanks was delivered to Ukraine on 23rd of September. On September 22nd, the European Commission reported on the transfer of €1.5 billion to the Kiev regime as part of a package of macro-financial assistance for 2023. Taking into account this new tranche, the Zelensky government has already received €13.5 billion out of the €18 billion promised this year. A new package of military aid for €400 million to Zelensky's regime was announced in Berlin. Kiev will be given Departsev-propelled anti-aircraft systems, MRAP armored vehicles, 155mm shells, Iris-T medium-range missiles, 50 surface drones, and others. The US and its NATO allies continue to bet on escalation of the conflict around Ukraine without considering any costs. All of that against the backdrop of talks of peace and negotiations that Russia apparently denies to have, and they do not care at all against what targets Western weapons will be used. They understand that civilians are the target. Kiev makes no secret of the fact that the Banderites dream of striking deep into Russian territory against major cities, transportation hubs, and civilian infrastructure. The Crimean Bridge may again be in the crosshairs, which the head of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, Mr. Budanov, promised to hit until its complete destruction, and not a single Western non-governmental infrastructure or international structure that proclaims to protect human rights or humanitarian principles saw anything wrong with this ideology. We have noticed how the voices of those who oppose the unrestrained pumping of arms into Ukraine are being silenced in the West. The tone is set by the Zelensky regime, whose representatives are not ashamed to directly threaten Americans who oppose financial support for Kiev. Information about such people is posted on the scandalously famous website Peacemaker, of course in quotation marks, not because it is the name, but of course because it goes against the self-proclaimed goal. As enemies of Ukraine, it is perceived by the Banderites as a verdict. They are perceived as criminals who receive a verdict. Relevant publications have already appeared in the media, but no one in Europe and across the ocean cares, because human rights for them is only a political instrument of pressure against other countries. Last week, Zelensky made another trip to North America. The formal reason was his participation in the 78th session of the UNGA. In reality, the current trip was more like a call to his superiors in Washington, D.C. Of course, with several changes. The hopes of the Ukrainian visitors for large cash injections and guaranteed supplies of modern weapons in the volume that was promised were not justified. The U.S. limited itself to allocating only a relatively small package of military aid. These expenditures, however, are more than compensated for by the enormous economic benefits that the United States derives from the conflict over Ukraine. A consolation for Zelensky was his blitz visit to Canada, where he was greeted happily, but of course they washed their hands afterwards, where he greeted a former Punisher of the infamous SS Division Galicia. And I don't mean our representatives, of course. They're only NATO representatives. Where he greeted a former Punisher of the infamous SS Division Galicia in the parliament. And aside from other stories, this one really blew up. This caused a resonance even in the West. Such unity between former and current supporters of fascist ideology once again confirms the neo-Nazi nature of the Kiev regime. I will comment on that later. On September the 30th, we will celebrate the first anniversary of the entry into Russia of the new constituent entities of the Federation, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. A year ago, their inhabitants exercised their legal right to self-determination in accordance with the UN Charter, the International Covenants on Human Rights of 1966, the Helsinki Final Acts of the CSSC of 1975, as well as the opinion of the UN International Court of Justice of Kosovo of 22nd July 2010, which confirmed the fact that the unilateral declaration of independence by a part of a state does not violate any norm of international law. The results of the referendum on September 23rd, 27th, 2022 speak for themselves. The residents of Donbas, Kherson, and Zaporozhye did not want to return to the former lives prepared by the neo-Nazi regime. They defended their right to speak Russian, honor their history and culture, having made a conscious and free choice in favor of Russia. The President of the Russian Federation proposed to celebrate September the 30th every year as the day of reunification of the Russian Federation with the new regions, having introduced in the State Duma the relevant draft amendments to the law on days of military glory and commemorative dates of Russia. The DNR, LNR, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions are. The President of the Russian Federation proposed to celebrate September the 30th every year as the day of reunification of the Russian Federation with the new regions, having introduced in the State Duma the relevant draft amendments to the law on days of military glory and commemorative dates of Russia. The DNR, LNR, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions are an integral part of our country, which should be completely liberated from the armed forces of Ukraine. It is quite symbolic that September 30th marks another important date. 80 years since the completion of the Chernihiv-Poltava strategic offensive operation by Soviet troops. It was conducted immediately after the Battle of Kursk Bulge and was the first stage of the battle for the Dnieper. It involved the main forces of three fronts: the Central, under the command of Rokossovsky, Voronezh, under the command of Vatutin, and Steppe, under the command of Konev. They were opposed by 700,000 group of Hitler's armies, center and south. Under the onslaught of the Red Army on September 15, 1943, the German command ordered its troops to move urgently behind the Dnieper to prevent further advance of our troops. The subsequent events are often referred to in historical literature as the run to the Dnieper. However, this did not help the Nazi invaders. On September 21st, 25th, the advanced units of all three Soviet fronts came to the Dnieper in different places, forced it, and created bridgeheads for the development of their offensive. On September 23rd, the enemy was knocked out of Poltava, and on September 29th, from Kremenchuk. The successful completion of the operation brought closer the defeat of the Wehrmacht near Kiev and the liberation of the city. The current followers of Bandera in Kiev and those behind them in the West should not forget about these events. And no matter how much the West pumps weapons into the Kiev regime, no matter how much it silences and indulges in its heinous crimes in an attempt to harm Russia, it does not and will not succeed. All goals and objectives of the special military operation, including the unconditional demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, will be fulfilled. Speaking of, we were mentioning the West, I would like to talk about British and their involvement in Bucha. We're conducting an objective investigation into the involvement of London, and in particular the British security services, in the staging of the provocation in the town of Bucha in March 2022. And we do not receive any participation from any other countries. For example, Sergei Lavrov previously appealed to UN Secretary General Mr. Guterres to use his capabilities and authority to obtain a list of the persons whose bodies were shown in Bucha. Seemingly, this should have been dealt with long ago. What could be more simple and natural if there have only been accusations. So what's more simple than understand who the victims are? Their names have not yet been received. They're being hidden, especially in London, which, as we know, in April last year, while chairing the UN Security Council, refused to convene a meeting of the Security Council on the events in Bucha. This speaks for itself, especially that the UN is trying to hide the truth about those events. And why? Because they took part in those. We're well aware of the active participation of British think tanks and PR agencies and the special services in the disinformation campaigns of the Kiev regime. For our part, we continue to monitor this activity and to add the heads of the most aggressive British propaganda structures to the Russian counter-sanctions list. And the information about it was published on the website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Of course, we've noticed on the 25th of September, during the Security Council session, the Independent International Commission presented another report about their activities, announced by their chair, Norwegian Mr. Mercy, their accusations that we cannot deem as anything but accusations without proof that are aimed at discrediting Russian military specialists. They fall against any critics. And the accusations of the committee are based on baseless stories by persons who pose themselves as the victims and the witnesses of the Russian military services committing those crimes. And I would like to remind you how many years we insisted that the representatives of Crimea, Donbass, and governmental organizations working in the region had the chance to share in the United Nations, in the Security Council, and in other UN bodies about the results of their work, and we were always denied that. Moreover, representatives threatened us, and peacemakers were included in the list just for trying to tell the truth. There were no restrictions with the Norwegian representative. The algorithm of working out such information is weird, especially the guarantees that witness statements received by Norway are not the results of special question and the questionnaire that was prepared by the UN. It is quite telling that the UN mechanisms blatantly ignore the facts of mass violations of the Kiev regime of human rights and norms of international humanitarian law. They prefer not to see the crimes committed by the Ukrainian armed forces, despite a lot of information presented by Russia. They do not see armed neo-Nazi regime's crimes against the civilians. Not once have they acknowledged the attempt to fully include the neo-Nazi ideology in the political state ideology of the modern Ukraine. Neither did they see tortures of Russian militants who were captured by the Ukrainian armed forces. All that while we repeatedly supply the UN Commissionary and other UN bodies with subsequent information collected by the International Common Tribunal on the neo-Nazi crimes and their allies, including video footage and more than 400 interviews of those who fell victims to their acts. And another report of the committee just proves very subjective, corrupted action of that organization that introduced this mechanism in March 2022, which is why Russia immediately denied any forms of connection with that structure. And the events of Bucha were necessary, these staged events, in order to have an argument to form such resolutions and structures to support their actions, to continuously reference Bucha as the very same event that proves Russia's crimes. So where are the lists of those who died in Bucha? Where are they? Where is the history of those people? Where are their relatives? We saw the photos presented by the Ukrainian side. And right there in the photos, we also saw video footage of numerous people. So what is stopping the Kiev regime? It's been almost a year and a half. What's stopping them from presenting part of their accusation, the information about those victims? There were no victims. It was staged. Classic staged scenario by the cliches of Nazis. That's how the fascist Nazis operated in 1945, and British special services know that all too well. And on the Canadian Parliament, an honoring of the Galicia, of course, it's the proclamation of hypocrisy. It doesn't mean that there won't be anything worse. It's just the illustration of what we've been speaking about. The September 22nd honoring in the Canadian Parliament of the 19-year-old Banderite Yaroslav Hunko, who served as a volunteer in the SS division Galicia, which was accompanied by applause of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Speaker and members of the House of Commons, the invited Western diplomatic corps, including characteristically the German ambassador, continues to cause outrage and condemnation even among Canada's closest allies, which was in no way expected by the ruling Liberals in the country.
I see that this caught them unaware. Trudeau himself excuses himself. He said that he was not aware of a speaker's initiative, and the speaker immediately repented. He's not a speaker anymore, and the Prime Minister's team began to cleanse the internet to hide the compromising footage. Funny people, aren't they? In the ignorance of the head of a government and his right hand, Deputy Prime Minister Christy Freeland, granddaughter of Bandera Mikhail Homak, I do not believe your words at all. Does this mean that they didn't know who they were applauding to? So how do they rule the country? But that's what's most important. Not only did they know, we are also the ideologists of those company in support of the Banderas, of the representatives of Galicia SS. We support them as the participants of these groups, the followers. We sponsor all those structures in the modern way. We finance them. We provide financial, political aid. Now it turns out what they didn't know. Oh, how convenient. They knew what they were doing. They have been doing it for many years. But it's just this time they overkilled it in the Russophobic rage. They insulted not only us, which they do regularly, but they also insulted the memory of the victims of the Holocaust and the anti-Polish mass terror. It's just that I don't understand why these celebrations were held in Ukraine with the same Galicia SS, with the same Banderas. Why do they not insult the memory of the Holocaust victims then? Why? Is it just a geographical question? So if they hold this fire parades of Ukraine, if they hold the portraits of Bandera and Shukhevich while doing so, and if they call the participants of the Nazi groups as heroes and they pay them, is this normal in the logic of the West? But if the same thing happens in Canada, with the participation of the Canadian authorities, this is not a very good thing. Why? What's the criteria? What's the standard? Trudeau and his entourage are trying to turn tables now. They say that what happened is the result of Russian propaganda and disinformation. Just how? There are these Russians who invited this Yaroslav Gunko. There are these Russians who wrote the speeches for Trudeau, the materials which helped him participate in this Nazi bacchanalia, whereas Russian papers which spoke highly of Zelensky in Canada, who wrote articles in favor of the Kiev regime. What kind of thing is Trudeau doing? What's this all about? It looks so ridiculous and so clumsy that in Canada itself, some journalists, which are not Russophiles at all, urge not to deny reality, and they urge people to take a proper look at what's happening in the light of the shameful praises of Yaroslav Gunko on the net. Those people who say that he's a Ukrainian and Canadian hero and a veteran of the Second World War who fought for Ukrainian independence from Russia. So that's what the media claim. We now inspire the armed forces of the Ukraine. So let's fall back on the well-known historical facts, how the executioners and punishers from USS Division Galicia were patronizing Canada. We have enough facts at hand. So the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Russian Embassy in Ottawa have repeatedly talked about the crimes of this Nazi formation and its history, its relocation to Canada after the defeat of the Third Reich, about the role of the descendants of the Bandera followers sheltered, brought up by the Anglo-Saxons in Canada. So there are those materials which mention the formation of the ultra-Nazi regime in Kiev, and I will share the links in the text of my briefing today. I will share all the material I have. So before TNSS's Volunteer Division Galicia was formed in 1943. It was formed from among the Ukrainian ultra-nationalists of our own UPA who were engaged in the extermination of civilians, which was their task. Not only did they fight, but they also fought against Russian, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews. They entered directly into combat operations with the Advanced Red Army only in the summer of 1944, when things went very badly for the Nazis. And in particular, Galicia was thrown into battle near Brody, where most of the division fell into the cauldron, and its losses amount to about 60% of the personnel. The remnants retreated together with the Wehrmacht and subsequently took part in the suppression of the Warsaw and the Slovak uprisings and fought with the Yugoslav partisans in January of 1945. So the frontline life of this unit, to which monuments have been erected to it in Canada, not only applauses, turned out to be very short and very shameful. So these punishers succeeded in the violence and reprisals against civilians, for which there is a lot of historical evidence. I will share all the links to that today in the text of the briefing, and today Canada, as we all know, is at the forefront of those in the West who actively falsify the history of the World War II. The horrification of the Nazi criminals and the glorification of them. There is a report of the Russian Foreign Ministry devoted to this on the situation of the glorification of Nazism and other practices that contribute to the escalation of modern forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. This report is published in August of 2022. Read it, please. And Justin Trudeau, who accuses Russia of disinformation as for what concerns the glorification of the Nazis, he claims that it's Russian propaganda. So I recommend Justin Trudeau to read this report as well. You can find it at the website of the Minister of Foreign Affairs that Chrystia Freeland printed for him. So Justin Trudeau will find a lot of interesting details about this. He could understand what the Russian Parliament or the Canadian authorities are being accused of. I think he knows about it. He just pretends not to know, because the Russophobia has reached such a clinical stage that those ALS are even ready to join the SS formations in the fight against Russia there, and Canada finance and trains the ideological layers of Galicia. It's a well-known fact. Nobody tries to hide it. Canadian MPs warmly applauded the Punisher who swore allegiance to Hitler, who fought against Nazism. And these were the MPs who had known the agenda beforehand. Hand in hand, have been elevated to the rank of state ideology retroactively by Trudeau, as Russian propaganda is a clear evidence. In the approach of the collective West is rubber standard. Just blame Russia for everything, and everything will be written off. It's not even funny. It's the world and all its allies. It's very symptomatic. Ruling elite and the aforementioned Chrystia Freeland distances himself from. She glorifies the memory about her grandfather. We have written a lot about him because during that Krakow and then in Vienna. What kind of paper is that? And the newspaper was then supervised by the Nazi special services. It was used as a mouthpiece for the propaganda of the Reich. So that's what the grandfather of Chrystia Freeland did, and Chrystia Freeland now is the Prime Minister of Canada. So don't you know what they invite? Who they invite to Canadian Parliament? Do you think that it's just the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament who had messed up? No, it was not a mistake. It was the long-term politic of the Canadian authorities. I wonder if now is there anyone, are there any descendants of those who fought against the Hitler death machine? Do they have anything to say? Will their voice be heard? Will anyone write an article? Will anyone speak against it? Will anybody speak at the Canadian Parliament? Because as I've seen this morning, the Canadian Parliament has started to distance itself from it. We tried to pass some kind of laws, some kind of statements. And do we really think that now, with the help of some sort of paper, we can hide we're sponsoring political as well as materialistic of the Hitler collaborationism, which had been happening for many years? No, no, no. This should be systematic. It's the person of a soulbox from the collaborationists to the anti-fascists. It's the political support of fascist groups and regimes in Canada. For its repentance for what they had done. It's the denial to continue the Nazi ideology inherent to the Canadian authorities now. And what's most shocking about the current situation is the reaction of the US, of the Great Britain, France, those states which are the permanent members of the Security Council of the UN. They had received those seats in the Security Council only because back then their soldiers, their troops, at the price of their own lives, fought for peace against the Nazis. And what now? Do they have they spoken? Have you pronounced a single word? Have you left a single comment on the social networks? Do you know what the representative of the State Department of the U.S. said? He said that he was very busy at the General Assembly of the UN. Do you believe that? No? Because the General Assembly of the UN is, firstly, takes place in New York, in the U.S. So there are papers coming out there, and all websites work in English, as well as TV channels. And also the headquarters of the UN, there is a Wi-Fi network. So do you believe that the State Department could have missed it when we talk about Canada, their neighbor country? Do you believe that the US could have missed what was happening right next to them, right in front of their nose, when there is interference with the domestic affairs of those states who are very far away from the U.S., who are not the allies of the U.S., who are not part of the same military blocs that the U.S. is part of, who want to have nothing in common with the U.S. But still, the U.S. constantly interfere with their domestic affairs, domestic policy, and blame them for human rights violation. And Canada is their neighbor. We speak English in Canada, so there is no need for translation. And it's of little importance of what language we use, because this was applause. No, we have never heard about anything like this, and I think we will never heard about anything from the Downing Street, the White House, the Champs-Élysées about that, because it's a bit different from harassing Russian journalists. It's a Nazi at the Canadian Parliament, and as you understand, it's some kind of a holy, sacred thing for them. Oh, yes, this is clearly a scandal that the West and the permanent representatives of the Security Council have failed to react to those scandalous fact of the support for the Nazi regime, of the neo-Nazi regime, and their refusal to refrain from glorifying the neo-Nazi regime and the Galicia SS group is a betrayal. It's a betrayal of the memory of American soldiers who died fighting against the Nazis, and the French soldiers, the British soldiers who died in the same way. And of course, it looks very cynical against the policy of U.S. of fighting anti-Semitism. So these are not just words. With only the words they use when it's in their own interest, and then they just turn the page and they forget about it. So how many words have been spoken when talking about Holocaust? There are many events held dedicated to it. There are laws passed, laws on the impossibility of denial and the criminal prosecution of the denial of the Holocaust. So here is a fact for you. That's something they had missed, we do not comment on. So this fact of this kind of discrimination only shows how cynical we are when we hold such events in Canada, and there is not a single doubt that we'll continue with that, as well as we will continue with the support for the Nazis. So it's time for the Center of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal and our people and countries who respect the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. It's time they understood that the Nazis went for Russians first, but they will come for them later on. Do you think you're safe from that? Of course not. And I'd like to highlight that the kind of flourishing of the Nazism regime by Ataba will not be ignored by us. And it's not about the protests. I think that this will have its toll on the Russia-Canadian relations, who are in a deep crisis now due to the Ataba position. We think that Canada is an unfriendly state who have shamefully cooperated with neo-Nazism, and we will remember about this when talking about foreign policy, I'd like to say a few words on the UN International Court in the framework of Russian-Ukrainian proceedings under the 1948 Genocide Convention. On September 25, oral hearings continued at the UN International Court of Justice in The Hague in the framework of Russian-Ukrainian proceedings under this convention. We have already commented on the beginning of the hearings, and I will share another link on that. This week, the Russian side reacted to the statements of Unlike NATO, Russia has not used accusations of genocide as a legal basis for its actions. In matters of a foundation of SDF, as well as the recognition of a DPR and LPR, we rely on the right to individual and collective self-defense and the right of the nations to self-determination enshrined in the UN Charter. The court was reminded again of the atrocities of Ukraine and Donbass and the neo-Nazi regime, the full connivance of the West. They pointed to a recent scandal in the Canadian Parliament where the disgraceful celebration of the Nazi criminal fact from what we had already talked about today took place, and the Russian team of lawyers, including representatives of the main legal schools of the world, gave a detailed legal argument about the inadmissibility of the Ukrainian complaint and the lack of jurisdiction for the court to consider the case, and we hope that the court will accept these arguments and maintain its independence against the background of unprecedented political pressure exerted on it.
Let's get down to the situation in Moldova. The Moldovan authorities continue to fuel the anti-Russian rhetoric. They accuse Russia of hybrid meddling, as they put it into domestic affairs of the Republic on September the 25th. President Sandu basically said that European values are incompatible with cooperation with Russia. Could you believe that? Basically, she didn't say anything new, but we're impressed with how she puts it. The Moldovan leadership fits into the anti-Russian campaign of the West. It's been living in this vicious paradigm of a friend or foe. That is exactly how it happened in Ukraine. We believe that such an approach is flawed. It does not meet the interest of the Moldovan people, who are traditionally friendly with regard to our country, but it is also fraught with repercussions for the domestic situation in Moldova. And here, Russia has nothing to do with that. Such kind of wording is blackmail against Moldovan citizens. That is putting Moldovan people hostage in the face of insane ambitions of Madam Sandu. As for the sweeping accusations regarding attempts to interfere into domestic affairs of Moldova, that's what we've been constantly hearing. Now officially declared that at the upcoming election, Russia would try to undermine the ability of citizens to implement their democratic choice through propaganda, dirty money, criminal gangs, and so on. As for the propaganda, dirty money, and criminal gangs, I believe that Madam Sandu knows it firsthand, but it has nothing to do with Russia. Why does the Moldovan leadership lie in such a way? The answer is obvious. Despite the significant support, including financial one, by the collective West, a month before the election, the ratings of the authorities are record low, and that is true. That comes as no surprise. It can be explained, but Madam Sandu keeps mum about that. The first social and economic situation in the country due to management flaws by Madam Sandu, as well as her team. And the situation is unfavorable, and there's no one to blame but Sandu. Second, the principles of democracy and the freedom of speech are not respected. They are trampled upon. The opposition is persecuted. Unfavored media is closed. Representatives of this media are deported on September 13th. This happened with Vitaly Denisov, representative of Sputnik Moldova. Examples abound. Third, the opinion of citizens of Moldova is ignored. Their legitimate rights are being ignored. And a case in point is when Moldovan language was renamed as a Romanian language. Was it that hard to calculate the response? This idea is something that was developed by the West, not only for Moldova. Another example is the neglect by Chisinau to the results of the expression of will by the citizens of Gagauze at the election of the heads of this region in April and May this year. The election was won by the opposition. They do not support the anti-Russian cause, and you do remember what Sandu did with them. That is why the Moldovan leadership had to spread these mottos regarding the imaginary Russian propaganda and the like to justify the new repressions against the dissent. I have a specific example in mind. On September 25th, Moldovan President Maia Sandu warned the regions that for some reason would elect representatives of criminal gangs, as she puts it, would see no money, no European money for the development of citizens. That's it. That is the kind of European values that are so cherished by Sandu and the likes. They sweepingly defame opponents, they oppress them by all means, economic and financial sanctions. Let us not forget about the fate of Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya destroyed by NATO. And if people choose representatives of criminal groups, what was Sandu doing all this time? It is Sandu's government who is to blame that the criminals are still on the loose, and now they invent some stories that some criminal gangs could be chosen by the citizens of Moldova. That's a funny thing to say. Where's your security service? Where are your law enforcers, Madam Sandu? What about the values to which Madam Sandu aspires when she says that these European values are not compatible with cooperation with Russia? With regard to the European values, can you please list them? What kind of European values are you talking about, and how are they being implemented, and how they are at odds with the cooperation with Russia? We would like to see the specific list, to read it, and to have some specific examples. Let us not have this empty talk without any specific examples. As for me, I have specific examples regarding European values that are allegedly implemented. Take a look at Lithuania. There's been a genuine witch hunt against an ice skater, Margarita Drobaska. But for what reason? Come to think of it, the Lithuanian authorities already took away her state awards under some absurd pretext. Allegedly, she represent a threat to national security of the country. Are these the kind of values that you are talking about? And sportsmen, due to their discipline, due to their will, achieve results, and after that, they become a threat to security and to these values. That is what Sandu's regime is aspiring to. And that is what it scares those who want to cooperate with their Russian friends, allies, brothers. Now the president of Lithuania signed a decree to deprive the ice skater of the Lithuanian citizenship. As is noted by Lithuanian experts that are politically motivated, that is a flagrant violation not only of the local regulation, but also of international and European standards. That is dictatorship, pure and simple, infringement of all the rights and all the legitimacy. What kind of European values are you talking about? Legitimacy, rights, and innocence until proven guilty. There is nothing of that. Madam Sandu is keeping mum about that, but I will tell you the truth. European values are about liberal economy, free economic relations that are built upon the rules of free market. What is left from this European, or rather the EU space? Only illegitimate unilateral sanctions, manual management of the regimes, and manual management by the European Commission of all these money flows, reckless, rampant corruption that we saw or during the COVID-19 pandemic when American vaccines were purchased en masse. What else? Traditions, religion, history. This has not been the case for quite some time in the territory of the EU because it has been oppressed by some empty talk about tolerance and new ethics. Now historical pieces of art cannot be performed in the theater, on stage, in movies. Everything is rewritten at the behest of new normal. That is exactly the kind of values that are promoted by Madame Sando. As for the European values, the genuine ones, they are cherished in our country. That is respect for world heritage, world religions, the free market, development of media, not in a selective way, but based on the laws that every country has, respect to the law, to regulation, to the principle innocent till proven guilty, but nobody will tell you that, and I'm addressing the citizens of Moldova, because the television has also been segregated in this country. As for Margarita Drobiazko, the goal of this campaign against the sportswoman is clear, is to intimidate their citizens, to those who, despite the anti-Russian propaganda, continue to work and live in our country, highlighting and not neglecting the connection with their historical motherland, with something that we have in common, with our past, with our culture. They don't need that. That has been trampled upon by the dictatorship of liberalism. Let's move on to another topic. The work of the emergency ministry in Libya. Upon the instruction of the minister, the emergency team is completing it in Libya for 10 days. Over 100 Russian first responders have been mitigating the Daniel cyclone at the very dangerous areas. The team included rescuers, divers, medical experts, psychologists, starting from the very start. AMERCOM cleared away almost 2,000 cubic meters of buildings, debris. They examined 610,000 square meters of territories, and they identified floating objects. 153 corpses were taken away. They were evacuated. Medical assistance was provided to more than 670 casualties, including 67 children. A few words on the session of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. It completed its work on October 25th in Riyadh. The committee includes 21 states, including Russia. We believe that the outcome was positive. The committee unanimously decided to include a 32nd Russian site, the Astronomical Observatory of the Kazan Federal University, to the list of World Heritage. This is the second Russian observatory that made this list. It is the second Russian site that is purely scientific and not religious or cultural. The first one is the Struve Geodetic Arc, that spans the territory of 10 states of Europe, including our country. Special value of this observatory is that so far it's been used for its initial purpose. It makes significant contribution to the development of world astronomy. The committee also considered the safety of 11 Russian sites. All the decisions taken are well balanced and objective. The member states agreed with our rationale regarding the site of Kamchatka volcanoes. Initially, it was proposed to list it in the World Heritage in Danger. The committee welcomed Russian efforts to preserve the sites, including regarding the Kluchevsky and South Kamchatka natural parks. This work has already been launched, and currently the Ministry of Natural Resources of Russia is engaged in this effort. The tasks were achieved thanks to the simultaneous interpretation into Russian. This allowed our experts to take full-fledged participation in the discussion. The discussions were purely professional, constructive, and depoliticized. there was no breaking news during the consideration of Ukrainian World Heritage Sites. Against this backdrop, we are surprised by the press release published by the UNESCO Secretariat. It does not reflect the atmosphere of the sessions, and it does not meet, that is not in line with the decisions taken. This is at odds with the neutral status of international officials. We regret to state that the employees of the UNESCO Secretariat are unbiased. They showed their unprofessionalism. And a few words on important dates. September 30th, in the Republic of Abkhazia, they celebrate the National Day, the Day of Victory and Independence. Best wishes to our Abkhazian friends. The congratulatory messages were sent by the Russian leadership, and the high-profile Russian delegation will attend the festivities in Sukhum. We note that throughout these years, Abkhazia achieved tangible progress in state building, living standards, important investment projects are implemented, international ties are enhanced, there's been an increase in tourist flows, Russia provides active assistance to that. We're implementing fundamental bilateral documents, including the Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance, dated 17th of September 2008, and the Treaty on Alliance and Strategic Partnership of November 24, 2014, as well as investment programs on assisting the development of Abkhazia and the program on common social and economic space between our countries. We seek to continue this joint work to strengthen Russia-Abkhaz friendship on all track. 1958, 2nd of October. That is the day of the proclamation of independence of the Guinea Republic. Several days afterwards, our country established diplomatic relations with it. For 65 years, our ties have enjoyed friendship and mutual respect. We maintain regular political dialogue of high level, high-profile delegation of this country headed by Foreign Minister that also included representative of the interim parliament of the country, took part in the second Russia-Africa summit. It was in July in St. Petersburg. In March, Moscow hosted the second International Parliamentary Conference, Russia-Africa, and on the sidelines of this conference there were negotiations between Mr. Volodin and head of the parliament of this country. We reaffirmed our commitment to developing the whole range of bilateral relations. We're successfully developing cooperation between foreign ministries. As for the international and regional agenda items, Russia and Guinea are virtually on the same page. The unbiased voting of Guinea representatives on the Ukrainian file and other anti-Russian initiatives in the General Assembly showed that the leadership of the country have a clear understanding of the root causes of the developments. We're actively developing bilateral trade and economic cooperation for more than 2 decades. Rusal has been active in this country. It is a key investor and it pays special attention to social issues of Guinea employees. It gives them the opportunity to get an education in Russian universities free of charge. Pau Severstal, Nordgold, is also active in the country. It is developing gold reserves in the country, and it provides more than 5,000 jobs to Guinean citizens. We're expanding ties in healthcare. The experts of Rospotrebnadzor are working in the country over the past 2 years in a number of populated areas. Our country opened 3 medical centers. In 2021, during the pandemic, we supplied over 400,000 vaccines, Sputnik V vaccines, worth $4 million USD. Since 1996, we have resumed providing state scholarships to Guinea. Over 2,000 Guinean students received education in Russia. As for the next academic year, the number of scholarships increased manyfold. We are ready to further develop our win-win cooperation on other tracks for the benefit of our peoples and stability on the continent. And best wishes to the citizens of this country. We wish every success and prosperity. September 30th is a very important date. the Munich Agreement anniversary, which is one of the most tragic and shameful events in the history of the European policy, which prefaced World War II. Probably it was the most shameful page. But currently what the Western community is doing, NATO, the EU, I believe that it dwarfs everything, even the Munich Agreement. And it all started back then. On 29th to 30th of September, the Prime Minister of the UK and France, Chamberlain and Daladier, with the mediation of the head of the fascist government, Mussolini, signed an agreement with Hitler and on the annexation of the Sudetenland to Germany. This share-out also included Poland and Hungary. Amendments to this text provide for the solution within 3 months to the issue of the Polish and Hungarian minority in the neighboring country. After that, Warsaw and Budapest grabbed chunks of Czechoslovakia, the Tichin region, Carpathian Ukraine, and part of Slovakia. The Polish government even was so impatient that it even startled the Western establishment. As Churchill put it, Warsaw, with hyena appetite, joined in the pillage and destruction of the Czechoslovak state by choosing to appease the aggression at the expense of the sovereign Czechoslovak state. The leaders of Western European countries believed that they could fend off their threat, and they could also channel German military machine towards the east against the Soviet Union. The same day, the UK signed a declaration, no aggression declaration, with Hitler, and 3 months afterwards, the same agreement was signed by France. Let me highlight that the UK and France were bound by allied agreement with Czechoslovakia, and they have moral responsibility for trampling upon its sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is a classic example of disastrous consequences that could be caused by neglect of Western countries to the norms of international law.
On September 30th, 1938 is a day that the West prefers not to remember. Neither London nor Paris has yet formally apologized to either the Czechs or the Slovaks for the crime committed against their state. Russian historians, however, have long since given an unambiguous assessment of the role of Western European countries in the Munich conspiracy. Relevant materials have been published on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. In 2008, on the 70th anniversary of the signing of the agreements in Munich, archival data were declassified, according to which it is possible to trace in detail the motives that pushed London and Paris to collude with Hitler. In 2018, based on the materials of the Rosarchiv and the Russian Historical Society, a large-scale documentary exhibition, Munich 38, on the threshold of catastrophe, was prepared. The domestic scientific community is continuing its efforts to bring the historical truth about the Munich conspiracy to the attention of the general public, and today the International Multimedia Press Center Russia Today will host a press conference with the participation of prominent historical scholars devoted to the 85th anniversary of the Munich conspiracy. We believe that London and Paris must recognize responsibility for the events of 85 years ago, and today, when the collective West supports the criminal regime in Kiev, the Munich Pact of September 30th, 1938 should serve as an admonition of how attempts to flirt with Nazism can turn out. And if historical realities are being revised, the realities of 18th, 19th, 17th century, I think that London and Paris are ready to admit the obvious and the criminal nature of the Munich Pact that they took part in. On the 3rd of October, we're celebrating 195 years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between Russia and Brazil. On the occasion of this memorable date, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in cooperation with the Brazilian Embassy in Moscow, have planned a number of events. Of the Russian Foreign Ministry will be organizing an exhibition of archival materials and photographs dedicated to the history of bilateral relations, which began with the decree signed on October 3rd, 1828, on the appointment of the first Russian envoy to Brazil, Franz Borel. The exhibition opening will be attended by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, heads of diplomatic missions of Latin America states and BRICS member states accredited in the Russian capital, representatives of domestic, socio-political, scientific, academic, and business circles, mass media. Within the framework of the celebration of the 195th anniversary of our diplomatic relations. There will be an exchange of messages from the ministers of foreign affairs of the two countries. Events are planned by the RZU in Brazil and the Brazilian diplomatic mission in Moscow. The International Life magazine will publish an article by Sergei Lavrov devoted to the history and current state of Russian-Brazilian ties. Today, our states are linked by relations of strategic partnership. Brazil is Russia's backbone partner in Latin America and the Caribbean, the world as a whole. Our countries are actively supporting political dialogue, expanding cooperation in trade and economic, scientific and technical, cultural and humanitarian areas, constructive interaction at key international platforms, first of all in the UN, BRICS, G20. Another date, on the 28th of September, we celebrate the International Day of the Access to Information, which was announced by the UNESCO. And the base of that document to remind the international community of the fundamental right of each human to have a right to information, which was enshrined in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Even then, it was universally recognized that the desire for an objective view of events was a natural and inalienable human need, and that universal and equal access to information was the foundation of a healthy democratic society. States have undertaken to ensure the necessary conditions for this right to be fully realized. And it seems like that was a false start. After 2015, despite that very same document, everything went the opposite way. The very countries of the collective West that were the loudest to proclaim their democracy and try to lecture the rest of the world have not hesitated to go into totalitarian censorship, made it an effort to suppress any pockets of dissent in violation of all international obligations. They literally eradicated sources of alternative viewpoints from the information spaces under their control. First of all, they got rid of the presence of the Russian media, using all conceivable and unthinkable repressive methods, from politically motivated broadcast bans and website blocking to psychological pressure on journalists and their criminal persecution. The neoliberal dictatorships, there is no other way of calling it, have tapped into the vast resources of Western IT companies and mainstream media giants in order to suppress, I will reiterate, any attempts by their public to look at what is happening in their countries from a different angle and to take a critical approach to assessing the actions of the officialdom with regard to our country. The most real zombification of the population with Russophobic rhetoric, and such approaches are aggressively imposed by the neoliberal West on the other members of the international community, from whom it demands in an ultimatum manner to stop rebroadcasting Russian television and radio channels popular with local audiences. What does it lead to? We see it in many countries. Refusal of many countries is the first sign of crisis in those countries. It is quite telling that the central theme of this year's International Day was the importance of online space for access to information, especially given the current state of the digital environment. After all, it is there that the accounts of Russian media and journalists are subjected to arbitrary deletions, blocking, and labeling, thanks to the efforts of the internet monopolist administration that look up to Washington. We ourselves at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have repeatedly encountered such arbitrariness and political censorship that we've mentioned numerous times, a blatant manifestation of the callousness and hypocrisy and the lack of morality of the advanced democracies and the international structures they have usurped in their lack of response to the terrorist attacks organized by the Kiev regime against Russian journalists and publicists, and their deliberate ignoring of the brutal murmurs of Daria Dugin, Vladislav Tatarsky, Oleg Klokov, and Mr. Zhuravlov, and other media representatives. And I'm only talking about the murders, how many attempts have been made, how many threats, and such actions are creating a terrible background for the International Day of Universal Access to Information. We should not celebrate it, but question whether we have a reason to celebrate it, or maybe we should start fighting. The persecution against the domestic media in the West has not subsided even now. Attention has already been drawn to the fact that a special, regularly updated section has been established on the web portal of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a partial list of the harassment faced by Russian media and journalists. Since February last year. To understand the scope of this problem, we recommend that everyone familiarize themselves with it. We have another important date, the 30th of September. The commemoration of Saint Jerome, the creator of canonical Latin text of the Bible, considered the patron saint of translation, is the International Translation Day established by the UNGA resolution. In today's international environment, the importance of translation, interpretation, and the responsibility that lies with translators is steadily increasing. They are the ones who stand next to political figures and translate their statements to the world during international negotiations and summits, during which the most important decisions are made that determine the fate of all mankind for many years to come. Without exaggeration, the maintenance of world peace and well-being, rapprochement of people, development of global dialogue, mutual understanding, cooperation, ensuring and strengthening of international security largely depend on the competent and coordinated work of interpreters, their ability to quickly navigate complex situations. Translation activity is so multifaceted that no artificial intelligence can compete with a human being in performing artistic, technical, political, and other types of translations. That's why we're against initiatives of forcefully, and not always, justified introducing of machine translation technologies in the work of the language services of various international organizations, and in particular the UN. Everything has to be introduced gradually, along with development. It has to function harmoniously, depending on the effectiveness. The Russian Foreign Ministry has traditionally paid great attention to the study of foreign languages and the improvement of translation skills. The Department of Linguistic Support, which grew out of the Translation Bureau of the USSR Ministry of Foreign Affairs established in 1955, unites in its ranks highly qualified specialists who have been successfully providing translation and interpretation support for the activities of this country's top leadership for many years. I am ready to answer all your questions. Is International Life with us today? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. How would you comment on the refusal of the US authorities to invite Russia to the upcoming APEC summit? Of course, we've seen such a decision, which fits in perfectly with the general pattern of behavior of the United States, which habitually abuses its international obligations as a host country. I'll just list down the examples, because such practice has been established over the years, where the US side shamelessly and systematically violates the fundamental 1947 headquarters agreement. How do we see it? They refuse to issue visas to official representatives from Russia and other countries as well. Within the framework of the recently concluded high-level week of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, was forced once again to call on the UN Secretary General to launch arbitration proceedings against the United States on this topic as soon as possible. It is regrettable that the leadership of the Secretariat is avoiding this long overdue step, thus encouraging irresponsible actions by the Americans. This is just one of the examples that the US have been known to act this way. As for APEC, we're not the only economies in the forum to face this problem. The confrontation fomented by the Americans, as we all well realize, is not limited to Russia. Washington, which of course feels very special and which fancies itself as an international referee, which is why they constantly seek to use the levers of diktat and the language of ultimatums in relation to a variety of international partners. And they are now being projected to APEC as well. Continue to push the Americans to perform their obligations. We are convinced that it's important to keep the APEC as the platform for the dialogue, which can't be usurped by one side in their unilateral interests. We're ready to work with other partners who share our positions. We will stimulate our colleagues to present protests against the American line of actions. And as the situation develops, we will also present our reaction. Another question: how would you characterize the humanitarian situation in Nagorno-Karabakh at the moment? We see that the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh remains difficult, to say the least. First of all, we would like to express our condolences to the families and friends of the victims of the explosion at the fuel and lubricants depot near Stepanakert on September 25th. And we wish all those injured a speedy recovery. Russian peacekeepers took a very active part in extinguishing the resulting fire and providing emergency medical assistance on the spot. The 120 residents of Nagorno-Karabakh who were seriously wounded in that tragic incident were evacuated by Russian helicopters to the territory of Armenia for further treatment in a specialized hospital. We will continue to make every effort to ensure normal life activity of the population. The main stabilizing mechanism in the region remains the Russian peacekeeping contingent, which is selflessly carrying out its duty. Thank you. Moving on. Is Russia Today with us today? Madam Zakharova, good afternoon. Russia Today. The Russian side has repeatedly said that the conflict in Ukraine would be over tomorrow if such a decision were taken in Washington. But at the same time, we recognize that everything is fine in Washington. The United States gives Ukraine money, which the United States Treasury Department issues in any necessary amount, despite the multi-trillion-dollar debt of the United States. In addition, U.S. arms companies are still making profits from these supplies. So why should the U.S. stop when the situation is so convenient for them? And what additional arguments could Moscow offer to stop this war? Why am I asked the question, why should the U.S. stop? We see that they are unwilling to stop. We see that the equilibrium that is being performed today with the word negotiations, peace, it's only to divert the attention from the main efforts that they're directing towards making this conflict last as long as possible, to make it slow going, but to prolong it as much as possible in order for this wound to never heal at all. And they're doing everything they can, supplying the arms, by providing political support, by providing money. Their direct involvement through special services and militia is obvious. Earlier, we mentioned that even the barbaric crimes against the civilians would not stop the United States from supplying the arms to Ukraine. I've mentioned all the data that we have collected on the scope of those supplies. Of course, they're less than before, but they're still continuing. And what is interesting, they're also getting the support of the European countries to support the Kiev regime. So no, they have no intention to stop. As for your second question, what should we do to stop this conflict around Ukraine? We've already mentioned this numerous times, that first of all, we have to stop pumping Ukrainian armed forces with arms. We need to stop Kiev regime from military actions and to withdraw Ukrainian troops from Russian territory, which we've mentioned numerous times, including. But first of all, of course, is stopping the sponsorship of terrorist acts by the Kiev regime. The USA and other countries, NATO countries, have laws about the inability and the legal persecution of those who are sponsoring terrorist regimes, terrorist acts, and Kiev regime is that of terrorist acts. Of course, different countries will define terrorism differently. Someone will call it terrorism, someone will say terrorist regime, someone will call those people terrorists. Each country sets its own definition. But I don't think it's up for question that this is in fact terrorist action. It's aimed at the civilians, it's aimed at threatening the civilians and civilian infrastructure. So the terrorists' character of Zelensky's team is obvious, and the US is sponsoring that despite their own legislature. Thank you very much. Moving on. Is Reiter with us today? Yes. Good afternoon, Madam Zakhar. Can you hear me? Yes, of course. You've just mentioned the arms supplies, and my question is about the publications in the mass media on the planned deliveries by the United States of long-range ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. And Russian side has stated numerous times that such missiles of such scope and of such radius, they are a red line of sorts. How would you comment that? I understand that. I would kindly ask you not to mention the red lines anymore, because we have corrected the journalists before who qualify this. What kind of red lines are we talking about? It's obvious that this is the sponsorship of the Western countries with the US at its head of the terrorist acts of the Kiev regime, and the terrorist nature of this regime of itself. And the same applies to your question as well. When it comes to the supplies of the long-range missiles to Ukraine, we need to understand, and I'm sure that Washington understands that, but I'm not sure that the American electorates understand that the Kiev regime uses it to strike social infrastructures and residential areas of Donbass and Crimea, which was performed in HIMARS, multiple rocket launchers, and 155mm cluster munitions for NATO artillery systems. The same will be performed with long-range missiles that you've mentioned. What will it lead to? This will only increase the suffering of the innocent civilians of Crimea and Novorossiya, who have been subjected to intimidation and genocide since 2014. And of course, this will lead to the reactive actions and the death of more civilians in Ukraine or those who affiliate with the Ukrainian armed forces. So that's it. This will be qualified judicially and historically. We've just mentioned the Second World War, that not everyone understood the idea immediately. A lot of people supported fascists, and people sponsored them the same way, the same countries. But then something went the other way. The Soviet Union, the Red Army, issued the verdict to the Germany, which gave the start to the anti-fascist movement, and the same thing will happen here. This tendency is already present here, and it will continue this way.
I understand you. Thank you. Another question, which I was planning to pose, concerned the negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia in Brussels, but as far as I understand, there were no news concerning this negotiation, so I don't think that there is any sense in comment on that. So instead of this, I would like to ask you about those piece of news we all received today, which concerns the Russia's decision to join China's sanctions on the Japanese export of seafoods due to the pollution of the ocean. I think you've commented on this before. So is there any information on Russia planning to join this kind of sanctions of China, or are we going to limit those import in any other way? First of all, I'd like to say that the subject of limitations, those limitations have nothing to do with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's up for the Ministry of the Agriculture and our kind of agencies and services. We always comment on that in detail, by the way, and I think I paid attention to, and I think that it's connected to the statement of the Japanese side. I think it's linked to the problem you've mentioned. So Tokyo has called upon Moscow to rely on scientific facts when making decisions about those subjects. So I'd like to respond in the same way to Tokyo. So we call upon Tokyo to rely on scientific facts when making decisions on supporting the Kiev regime, and I hope what happened in the Canadian Parliament will be analyzed in detail, relying on scientific facts, because history is a science as well. That's clear. Thank you very much. Let's continue with Sputnik here. Yes, good afternoon, Andrei Matyukin, Sputnik Radio. Maria Vladimirovna, the Minister of Foreign Affairs issued a statement linked to the Armenian Prime Minister's Pashinyan statement and the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. So have there been any contact ever since, and did Yerevan hear us? Are there any constructive measures to be taken to normalize relations? As for the reaction of Yerevan, I think that it's Yerevan you should ask. I think that what's happening there now, I think that even those who can't hear would have heard that, because it's not about the reaction of Moscow. It's just this kind of reaction which we have seen around the world. As for the contacts, we continue on different levels, and we hope that our signals will be heard and interpreted in the right way. It's some kind of a retaliation measure. We have already written about this when issuing the statement. And thirdly, and most importantly, Russia has always been careful about its alliance with Armenia. We have never started to make any steps what would deteriorate them, and we have already supported the Armenian nation in all difficult situations, and we'll continue to do that, and all kind of negotiations on the deepening the cooperation will be continued with in the interest of both countries. Thank you. Is Russia Today here? Yes, good afternoon. We have several questions. Firstly, how would you comment on the words of the Azerbaijani President Aliyev during a meeting on September 25 with Turkish President Erdogan? He said that the Soviet authorities separated Western Zanzibar from Azerbaijan, and thus the geographical connection between the main part of Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan was interrupted. And also, we would like to pick your brain on the statement of Erdogan regarding the possibility of the imminent opening of the Zanzibar corridor. First of all, I think that today we should not pay too much attention to history, not because we do not respect history, but because you see that history is an integral part of today's briefing, of all the briefings, but that situation is changing rapidly internationally. We know about it in detail, and today, during today's era and during the Soviet period, I would not like to comment the historical aspect because the situation is changing rapidly, and it calls for timely comments more than history does, I guess. And secondly, commenting on history and historical facts just take up too much time. I think that there are those experts in this field who you'd rather address this question to. So I'd like to comment on your second issue. So as for timely comments, what it calls for, Armenia and Azerbaijan, as you know, have recognized its own the territorial integrity of each other. That's what we're going to keep in mind when taking further practical steps. And as for situations over there, we call for a political and diplomatic settlement of the conflict. And as you know, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and our union states, and we go on with the alliance declaration, which was signed in 2022, and as for deblocking the transport communication in the region, this question was studied carefully under the presidency of the vice prime ministers of Russia and Azerbaijan. I think that was a kind of a format what will help us find an acceptable solution which would guarantee the sovereignty and jurisdiction of each of the countries of the words of passing for its national territory. And such kind of agreements based on the balance of interests will benefit both the states of the region and their neighbors, including Russia, Turkey, and Iran. Yes, thank you. And another question. Last week you met with a interim execution minister Natalia Baran, and later on, when investigations were carried out linked to the illegal financing. So how could you comment on that? You know, it's funny and tragic at the same time. So what's tragic about it is what I've already said, that it has to do with many candidates and politicians that want to realize the right to be heard in today's Moldavia. So we arrested the harassed. I think it is tragic. It is sad. But what's funny about it is that, you know, in the light of the upcoming general election in Moldavia on November the 5th, the authorities have started to reform these security services, the law enforcement, and we know what the objective is to neutralize Russia's information presence there and creation of the policy tools for Washington regime. But as two American delegations headed for Moldavia, and from 18 to 19 September, headed by the representative of the State Department. So those delegations headed there. They included Mr. Schiller, and the question is, the searches concerning those politicians who had met with Rubin and Schiller, have they been held already? Or do they only concern those citizens who meet with representatives of Russia, with Russian politicians and journalists? So I think that it's time to check what those civil servants of Moldavia, which had met with the representatives of the State Department in the Bureau on Military Affairs. So I think we should understand what's happening there. What have those meetings cost? What have they brought about? It's against the current policy of the Moldavian regime. As a result, we have signed a memorandum on cooperation in fighting foreign manipulation of information, and also a meeting with the head of the border service was held. These are Western standards. Don't you think that this is interference with the domestic affairs of Moldavia in light of the upcoming elections? Don't you think that it's American influence, not only on the minds of the Moldavian electorate, but also on the tools which should be democratic, but is now too influenced by the Western states and serves the interests of anti-states? Should the Moldavian authorities not check who and the Moldavian authorities have met and why? Deepening this context, on the 23rd of September, during the project of deepening the potential of Moldavian policy offices, during this meeting we also opened a new center for law enforcement. So I really hope that there is no link between this meeting, between my meeting with Natalia Paraska and the pressure that's been exercised on the Renaissance Party. I hope it has nothing to do with our relations between Russia and Moldova, but I see what's happening. I see this American descent there. In the light of the upcoming elections, I think that it has to do with those areas that have to do with the pre-electoral situation in Moldova. You cannot turn a blind eye to this. And I hope that the situation will not bring about another political crisis and will be settled legally. I'm talking about Natalia Paraska as well as many other politicians and public figures of Moldova as well as Moldavian journalists. Any other questions? No, thank you. Let's continue. Is Комсомольская правда here? Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. Good afternoon. How could you comment on yesterday's statement of the, Mr. Klimkin on the fact that the Ukrainian issue has stopped being the major one on international agenda? Sorry, could you repeat, please? Klimkin said yesterday that the subject of Ukrainian has ceased to be the main one on international agenda. How could you comment on that? Well, you know, frankly speaking, I think that were different ways to respond to this question depending on what Klimkin had in mind. Fortunately, I'm not familiar with his, how to put it, his way of thinking. But since you have quoted him, let's try to muse on that. If we're talking about the mentioning of Ukraine and the Ukrainian issue, Ukrainian crisis, it still continues to be one of the priorities. And there are countries who talk about Ukraine, and as we see the meetings of the sessions of the General Assembly, so they can be divided into two groups. Those who support the Kiev regime in all ways, who applaud themselves in supporting the Kiev regime, and we talk about the way we're going to do away with Russia. And there are also those, which is the second group of countries, who try to figure out their own understanding of the settlement of this crisis, which is evident for many countries, in spite of them being far away from the subject, their non-participation in the crisis, because we understand that a lot depends on it. In this world, international relations depend on it. So from that point of view, this situation is of great concern to many countries, because those who think and act constructively, you know, there are more than 20 projects of the understanding of how the settlement of this conflict could be carried out, and I should pay tribute to those countries who are quite far away from its regional agenda, who have never been linked to the situation. I should pay tribute to their decision to contribute. I think that with politicians, states, public figures, which I think calls for applause. So there's a lot going on there, but there are two main opinions. Another thing is what Klimkin probably meant is what we're talking about in Ukraine. So many people are talking about this. These are those who until recently had associated themselves with Zelensky, the Kiev regime, and so on. So maybe he meant that the same attention, the same heartbreak which accompanied Zelensky's presence before has disappeared. So now he's looked down on. You can see it from the American newspapers. You can see it from those videos, from those posters at New York streets with the glory to urine kind of comments. Many people, millions of people have seen that on the net as well. I think so we're hostages to themselves now, those who now pretend with disdain that we're tired of Zelensky, now we're hostage to themselves because we were them who had created this kind of image for Zelensky. We came up with this kind of camouflage with all those battery tank tops and those strange trousers. With were Ram who had created those staged reportages. They had came up with the idea of Zelensky and his spouse posing in the fields, so to say. So now they're gathering what they had. So they got those image of a dictator that they cannot do away with now, no matter what Zelensky wears now, no matter what he says, how he acts with images here now. It's completed. It's those kind of a travesty of a dictator. The Hollywood was talking about when creating films about the acts of evil. So now it has come to life in the form of Zelensky through all those campaigns that had came up with the idea of his clothes, his manner of speech. They got what they wanted. So I fully agree with Klimkin here, which is a rare occasion. So I think that the interest is gone. The interest in kind of a bravade, applause, glorifying is gone. But ladies and gentlemen from the Western liberal democracies, here you are. That's your client. That's your creation. And I think it's rather a creature than a creation. So it's up for you to do with him now. So please do not look down on him. He was born thanks to you. No, I would not quote Taras Bulba now. So live with that now. Thank you. Is news through here? Good afternoon, news through. So the first question is: are there any chances you've already touched upon the subject? So I'd like to deepen it now. Are there any chances now to restore relations between Moscow and Iran at the same level? And what's necessary for this, as the European authorities continue to call for international? So does Russia recognize Karabakh as a part of Azerbaijan? I have already talked about this at the beginning of a briefing, so we still keep on with our international relations and contacts. So you should not pay any attention to those who make extremist statements now of any kind, who doubt our relations. This will be gone. We have already seen this. We have already seen the example of other countries.
We understand who is behind such sentiments and who fuels them. You see, the people of Armenia has been tried and tested. This is the kind of people who witnessed such tragedies in their lives that had never been seen by any other people. These people know who is a friend, who is a foe, and who is somebody else. The people of Armenia knows that the assistance in various forms and shapes has always come from Russia. The territory of Russia welcomed a plethora of people from Armenia in different points of history. Either these were our peacekeepers or our humanitarian aid or our humanitarian support, economic support. This came in different shapes, and the people of Armenia knows that and remembers that, despite the fact that enormous resources have been invested to ensure this media coverage and indoctrination in Armenia. 2,000 people, these are employees of the US Embassy who are doing just that, the indoctrination of the information space in Armenia. Once again, we are witnessing this. This is witnessed by everyone, and this too shall pass. Hopefully, this will don't do any damage, or minimum damage, where we see the foot of the Americans or the hand of the Americans. Unfortunately, there are deep crises there. Unfortunately, we witness it in this region because over the past year, the Western world, Washington, Brussels, Paris, were the ones to claim that they are the new mediators and new guarantors. You all see how it all ended up. Russia continues its mission. Our peacekeepers are deployed in the region. And that is the best confirmation of our genuine intentions and our genuine attitude. Let me reiterate, we have always treated carefully our alliance with Armenia, and we will never trigger and fuel tensions in these relations. When it comes to bilateral relations, we'll further implement all the agreements for the benefit of the two peoples. Thank you. And the second question, what's your take on the decision by Washington not to invite President Putin to APEC summit? I've already commented on that as I answered the first question, which was exactly the same. And the third, the White House claimed that in the near weeks, the U.S. would exhaust all the means to support Ukraine. What could it lead to? Maybe it could lead to peaceful negotiations. I've already mentioned that the U.S. assistance is ongoing. Well, it is not that significant as compared to previous times. You should bear in mind that they have this electoral cycle, and some voters ask uncomfortable questions. Why does Biden administration help the armed forces of Ukraine more than it helps the citizens of the U.S.? And how come that the U.S. face an economic crisis? They reject the word recession, but the crisis is obvious. Why don't they get the same kind of amount from the White House, from their government, like the Kiev regime, given the failed plans on the counteroffensive and everything that was pledged by Washington to Kiev? It is all fine-tuned on an ad hoc basis, but the assistance is still ongoing, material, financial, ideological, and so on, including Washington's assault on its allies, NATO allies. That's how I would respond to your question. Thank you. Thank you. CGTN TV, are you here with us? Hello, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Recently, China published its White House, the joint building of community of the common fate of humanity. The book has some wordings that this concept is not replacing another system or civilization to another. It is a way to mutual benefit. Over the past 10 years, this concept has been, well, it hasn't been changed, it's been developing. What's your take on this book and the importance of this concept? Have you familiarized yourself with this book? You know, we believe that the content of this book is of interest to a broad audience and, of course, the international experts. I would like to highlight specifically that this year, this spring, Russian president updated the foreign policy concept, and the provisions of our Russian document in many ways are similar to the Chinese concept of the common fate of humanity. We share the call for the solidarity of the international community as we respond to the common challenges of today, confronting traditional and unconventional security threats. We stand together with China for building of a more just world order, cooperation on an equal footing, developing interstate relations that would be built on the principles of the United Nations Charter and the international law in general, and not some kind of rules-based order that is promoted by the West. Just to give you an idea of the common ground that we have. Thank you. Commerçant, are you here with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova. Hello. US Navy during joint exercises with the Danish Navy for the first time deployed at the Danish island of Bornholm. They also deployed Raytheon Standard SM-6 for the first time. What's Russia's take on this, given the moratorium on the post-INF treaty? Is it of any importance, or do you think that that violates the moratorium and Russia has the right to deploy such systems in its territory? We're talking about container launcher MK-70. It was established on the basis of the MK-41 models, and it ensures the use of not only SM-6 that is developed on the basis of anti-missile interceptor, but also it can be used for Tomahawk, which have longer range. That's not the first time we see this launch in Europe. A year ago, the US Navy deployed an MK-70 prototype to one of the European NATO countries in order to showcase such an opportunity. At that time, though, this kind of demonstration was pretty commented in a vague way. Pentagon representatives were shy about calling and describing the state where it happened over the past years. The State Department doesn't say a word regarding active efforts by the Americans regarding the deployment of these systems in Europe and the Asia Pacific. As the tradition goes, when it is not beneficial to the US, they make it look like nothing happens. They ignored this scandal in the Canadian Parliament, and by the same token, they ignore their actions in this case. But this time, the US Navy demonstratively started using this MK-70 launcher during the exercise. This exercise takes place in Europe. It engaged NATO allies of Washington, and by doing so, Washington started drilling and the deployment of missile systems to Europe. These systems were previously banned under the INF treaty that Washington deliberately dismantled. Russia announced a unilateral moratorium for the deployment of the INF, and given that we keep close track of the US steps to implement destabilizing plans, the deployment of these weapons, let me remind you that the Russian moratorium is directly affected by the appearance of the American missiles in the region. And I would kindly like to draw the attention of American media and journalists to this information so that it wouldn't come as a surprise to them to see something of that kind in the future. Since you have no further questions, Anadolu. Hello, Madam Zakharova. Anadolu, Turkey. We have two questions today. The first one, do you have any data on new high-tech Western weapons supplied to Ukraine over the past days or weeks? Reportedly, Crimea was attacked by some kind of new weapons. If that is the case, will Russia impose sanctions on the supplier states? Could you please comment on the statement by Zelensky that the first batch of American Abrams tanks was already delivered to Ukraine? I've already commented on this topic. According to our data, the US and its NATO allies, as part of the new weapons supplies, have already sent a limited number of Abrams tanks, old modifications from the storage facilities of the US. According to some experts, that would not be a game changer in the line of contact between Russia and the armed forces of Ukraine. As for the recent missile attacks against the Crimea and directly against the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol, Storm Shadow was used, and they are supplied by London. And to this end, the frontal aviation MiG-29 and Su-24 were used. Thanks a lot. And the second question, President Emmanuel Macron of France, in his interview with French TV channels, called Russia an accomplice of Azerbaijan. He also hinted that Russia could pose a threat to the territorial integrity of Armenia. Could you comment on that? Well, he fantasizes a lot. Only a man with a lot of fantasies could say something of this sort. Probably the president of France knows something about territorial integrity that nobody else knows. We would like to see his viewpoint, to make him share what he knows. Probably we don't know something, but let me warn you that in this case nobody knows about that except for Macron and those who wrote to him. I believe that that is another hypocritical attempt, and by doing such statements, he exposes what is actually happening. We said that the officials in Yerevan try to shun the responsibility, try to put the responsibility to others, and now we see who pushes them to do that. Here the president of France used some odd wording, language regarding the threat to territorial integrity without making any direct statements, and they try to put responsibility to Russia. By the same token, they encouraged officials in Yerevan to make steps to put responsibility to Russia or somebody else. We are well aware of these steps by the authorities in Washington, and a wonderful case in point is the African continent. A lot of African countries were saying that Paris was doing exactly the same. First it promises, then it doesn't live up to its promise. But in critical times, it abandons its plans, it withdraws from these countries, betraying partners and making the situation in these regions an explosive one. Well, this is aiding and abetting, that is provocation by the French officials, and obviously we see their bias in the Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict when they did not present themselves as a mediator that sought to bring peace to the region, but they were guided by their own political interests. Thank you. By the way, I really liked this phrase. I believe that the language is wonderful. We need to just make certain changes. He said that Russia is an accomplice to Azerbaijan, which can threaten territorial integrity of Armenia. That is an impeccable wording, but let's put it differently. France is an accomplice to the Kiev regime, which can present it to a threat to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That is a wonderful wording. I kindly recommend the Elysee Palace to use it. Izvestia, are you here with us? Hello, good day. Deputy Foreign Minister of South Korea summoned Russian ambassador for talks. He called him to abandon military cooperation with North Korea. What is the take of the foreign ministry on this step? You know, on the 21st of September, Deputy Foreign Minister Rudenko had the same meeting with South Korean ambassador in Moscow. You have the relevant info on our website. As for the Russian position with regard to the same visit in South Korea, we dwelled on it during our previous briefing on September 19th. The Moscow Post. Hello, we had 3 questions. You answered the first one regarding a flagrant incident in the Canadian Parliament. The second one, in the statement of your foreign ministry, Armenia is called a hostage to the political games of the West. How do you assess the goal of Washington? What can Armenia and CSTO allies expect from it? How can the situation in Armenia destabilize the shared geopolitical space. I believe that you have listed a lot of questions, but they are answered in the statement that you made reference to. It highlights that the US and NATO countries sought to destabilize our common space, the post-Soviet territories as the arena for geopolitical struggle with Russia, the developments around Ukraine, exposed that their main goal is to squeeze Russia out of South Caucasus. And to achieve this maniac purpose, they are willing to make all the sacrifices, be it instability or war. We see that the Americans are indoctrinating Yerevan. The US aid has come to Armenia, just like the Assistant Secretary Kim. During the hearings, they confessed they are trying to nudge countries against cooperating with Russia, and that was happening over the past days, and it is not concealed by anyone. According to the reports, Washington and Brussels urge Armenia to get out of the CSTO, to sign a peace treaty with Azerbaijan without any account for the rights and security of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. We see that as they pursue their goal, the West forgot about their own values with regard to human rights, for instance. That is another way of pseudo-democracy. They turn a blind eye to beatings of protesters in Armenia. We've always said that it's up to a country to sort out the domestic affairs. As for the US and protesters in Iran, if they saw what was happening in Iran from the State Department, probably they saw what was happening in Yerevan, but still they are keeping mum. They simply do not see that. They do not want to comment on what is happening with the opposition. They see threats in case they keep up with their rallies. These are not double standards. This is the complete lack of standards, trampling upon the democratic values and basically meddling into domestic affairs of sovereign states. Thank you. The next question.
The authorities of the unrecognized Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus said that they are waiting for the opening of a Russian consulate, and they referred to Erdogan, who said that he had discussed this issue with Vladimir Putin. What can you say about this? As for the status and the format, this is currently being discussed, but I can say that as for the Russian citizens who are living in the territory of the Northern Cyprus, the necessity of the consulate is long overdue, which is why on the 21st of September, we held another consular reception in the northern part of Nicosia. The reception was provided by 2 mobile field complexes, which are able to process applications for the issuance of new generation passports. More than 70 applications of citizens were accepted, 15 passports were issued to underage citizens. A large number of applications for the acquisition of Russian citizenship by children were also accepted, and groups of consular staff visited citizens who could not come for health reasons at home. This work will continue. The total in the northern part of Nicosia. The reception was provided by 2 mobile field complexes, which are able to process applications for the issuance of new generation passports. More than 70 applications of citizens were accepted, 15 passports were issued to underage citizens. A large number of applications for the acquisition of Russian citizenship by children were also accepted, and groups of consular staff visited citizens who could not come for health reasons at home. This work will continue. The total number of people who have already received consular services have signed up to receive them is approaching 1,000 people. This is the most recent data. The next consular session will take place at the end of September. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is the Media Alliance of Russian Societies with us today? I'd like to ask you to keep short because we're short of time. Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have a different situation. due to the shortening of the diplomatic staff and the closure of consulates, which is why there's a problem of exchanging old passports to the new ones. Are there any updates? Is there anything you can do to help? I can tell you that we will give you a detailed answer with a reference to the documents in the text of today's briefing, where we will explain in detail all the procedures. Thank you. Thank you. This will be all for today, and I'll see you at the next briefing. I wanted to say the next date, but it's just our briefing. Wish you all the best. Bye.